We come this morning to someone that most of you have likely heard of, though if you haven't, you've probably been influenced by many of his ideas, whether you realize it or not. And so we come this morning to the Dutchman, yes, another Dutchman, Abraham Kuyper. Just a few books. I know some of you really like to do some reading on your own. You'll hear that Kuyper was a voluminous writer and did more things than 5 normal human beings would do. He was sort of like Winston Churchill in that regard. You say, how did you do all these things? But probably the most famous, best, relatively short entree into his ideas is this book. There's newer versions out there. I pulled this one from Brother Bruce Creswell's library. Lectures on Calvinism. These were the stone lectures that he gave at Princeton. Came over to America, gave the lectures 1898, and this is 200 pages. This will give you his big ideas. There's lots of other things. There is a movement, and I'll explain it to you in just a moment, associated with Kuyper called Neo-Calvinism. This is a book that came out in 2022, a theological introduction by Corey Brock. Gray Sutanto. Gray is an RTS professor in D.C., so this is a really nice, handsome volume, introduction, and as you'll hear, the two main thinkers associated with this movement that came out of the Netherlands, Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck, and then this is the major biography that came out about 10 years ago by James Bratt from Calvin College, Abraham Kuyper, Modern Calvinist Christian Democrat. Of course, Democrat there means something different in the Netherlands than it would here in the United States. In 2009, Time magazine ran a story on 10 ideas changing the world right now. I remember reading this article. Perhaps some of you have heard it referenced before. It's quite remarkable. Time magazine. 2009, 10 ideas changing the world. The third idea on the list was the new Calvinism. And as it looked to Calvin's 500th birthday, which I hope you celebrated back in 2009, this article mentioned the popularity of a new Bible translation that was less than 10 years old called the ESV, which was associated with a lot of Calvinist scholars, preachers like John Piper, Mark Driscoll, who's had his many twists and turns since then. And the writer mentioned Colin Hansen's book, Young, Restless, and Reformed. Back when I had a blog at the Gospel Coalition, I called it DeYoung, Restless, and Reformed. And now I get many such jokes. What do you do now that you're de-middle-aged? On your way to being de-old, no longer... So I'm no longer young. I don't know that I ever really was restless. I still am reformed. The renewed interest among younger Christians in the soteriology of John Calvin, which has lasted in some ways over these 15 years, and in some ways this movement has faded as a movement. Sometimes what's called YRR, Young, Restless, Reformed. Sometimes the Reformed Resurgence, or Time magazine there called it the New Calvinism. Now I mention that because that nomenclature has caused some confusion because there is something older, more established, more defined, and probably will prove to be more influential called Neo-Calvinism. Now neo, that prefix just means new, so you can understand the confusion. In fact, some people were calling this Reformed Resurgence Neo-Calvinism. They said, time out. There is something historically that has gone by that name, Neo-Calvinism. And it didn't start in North America, though perhaps its most enduring influence is in the United States and in Canada, in particular where Dutch settlers have gone. But the movement began in the Netherlands. Neo-Calvinism, as the name suggests, was an idea, it was an impulse, and then it really became a movement focused on this question: how can we Reformed people be orthodox and modern. That was the language they used. How to be orthodox and modern. Now, we're not going to talk too much about the other significant figure here, Herman Bavinck. You may have heard of his theology. It was a 2008 Baker published for the first time an English translation of the full 4 volumes of his Reformed dogmatics. So since 2008, there's lots of people doing research, doctoral work, now that more and more, and most of his, there's lots to be translated still, but his major works are in English now. Some scholars even argued that Herman Bavinck, there were 2 Herman Bavincks. There was an Orthodox one and there was a modern one. And recent biography, James Eglinton, he was here and did a lecture in RTS last year. Eglinton, he's Orthodox Calvinist. He's in Edinburgh. He did a biography on Bavinck, if you want to read that, and says, no, there's one Bavinck, but he was trying to show how to be Orthodox and modern. So this neo-Calvinism is trying to forge a path here at the end of the 19th into the 20th century, how to hold these 2 things together. An early study of Kuyper said his neo-Calvinism was "Iets anders dan het dorst," which means something other than Dort. Perhaps you remember the Synod of Dort, 1618 and 1619. Did a class here a year or 2 ago on the canons of Dort, which is where we get the 5 points of Calvinism, have come to us as an acronym now as TULIP. That Synod of Dort, those canons of Dort, Kuyper, as we'll hear, owned that, absolutely. He owned all of the hard edges and angularity of Calvinism, but he wanted to say, what is something beyond Dort? Not leaving it behind that we no longer believe it, but that Reformed theology and Reformed world and life view, which is language you probably all have heard before and was popularized by Kuyper. What does this look like in our world? That's the neo in neo-Calvinism. They were adamant that we cannot, here's a word maybe you've heard before, repristinate the past. That just means we can't go back and recreate 1618 and 1619. Even if we wanted to, we can't. And if you ask any historian, I've said before, if you ask any historian, even though they love history, of all the ages you could live in, which one would you want to live in? Any historian who knows what he's talking about will say, this one. I like air conditioning, I like indoor plumbing, I like modern medicine. Of course, there are better things with different ages in the past, but his point was, we cannot simply try to recreate the glory years of Calvinism gone by. What does it look like? Modern life, how we relate this Reformed theology to all of life. And you might say, with trying to find, I hate to use the word a middle path or a third way, but was trying to avoid, as one author puts it, a forgetful liberalism that forgot the truth of the past, and also avoid a dead conservatism, that is just an orthodoxy that has lost its vibrancy. That's the neo in neo-Calvinism. The 2 most important voices, the theologian Herman Bavinck, and he also did many other things, and then the theologian, newspaper editor, journalist, university founder, political activist, educational reformer, and Dutch prime minister, to name but some of what he did, Abraham Kuyper. And as we go through and hopefully have time at the end to summarize some of his big ideas, you'll see that we've all been influenced by many of his big ideas, and yet I think they also leave open a lot of inherent tensions. And so as you hear me explain his big ideas, don't think every single one of them, yes, Pastor is 100% for that idea. We've been influenced by them. There's much to learn from them. And there continues to be a lot of debate about how to apply or if they can be applied in such a different world. Abraham Kuyper was born on October 29, 1837 in Maassluis, South Holland, to Jan Frederik and Henrietta Huber Kuyper. His father was a minister. I'm going to just help you keep score a little bit with all of these Dutch churches. I know you're very excited for more Dutch. The national church the Nederlandse Hervormde Kerk, or the NHK. That's the National Reformed, Hervormde Reformed, the Netherlands Reformed Church. So that's the state national Reformed Church. His father, NHK, was a pastor in this. Later, they moved to Middelburg in the province of Zeeland, then to Leiden, because he was a very precocious young boy, and they wanted him to attend the best schools, and so they moved to Leiden. He was a brilliant student. He became a modernist. He learned liberal theology from his graduate mentor, J.H. Skolton, and he came out of his education at Leiden looking down on the naivete of traditional Christians. While he was there, he won a national scholarship competition in 1860. It was a big deal. He then suffered the first of several nervous breakdowns. At least 3 times, Abraham Kuyper, in his adult life, had major, we would call them nervous breakdowns, just collapses. He had to stop everything. He had to go, as we saw a little bit with Spurgeon. Now, this wasn't quite depression. It was more overwhelmed, exhaustion, anxiety, nervous breakdown, and he has to go and find some warmer weather and recuperate for weeks, months at a time. He has the first of those in 1861. He finished his doctorate in 1862. He marries Johanna Schke in 1863. He pastors a small church in a town called Beest, B-E-S-D, out in the country. And he teaches what he learned. So he grew up in this state church, and his father was a pastor and probably somewhat of a moderate. And he becomes a liberal. Next week we'll say more about theological liberalism when we look at Harry Emerson Fosdick and also J. Gresham Machen. So he is teaching this stale, to these ordinary people, rather lifeless modernist doctrine. They don't particularly appreciate what their new pastor is giving to them. And he is at first rather vain and smug. But he sees in their pietism and their deep, simple faith something that he knew he was lacking. And Johanna gives to him a book that she wants him to read. And Kuyper later will relate that this was his conversion. He grew up in the church, but his conversion. And it says probably something important about Kuyper and the whole project that will come from him, that he dates his conversion to a novel. That may say something about why he had such an expansive view for Christianity and all of life, and perhaps his openness to, it wasn't that he learned the gospel from this novel. He had grown up with all of the truth, but it was like the match that finally lit the kindling in his heart. I wonder if any of you have read this novel. I have not. I just ordered it on Amazon. My wife, who knows much more has read much more of Victorian English literature than I have, it's also not read it, and I told her about it. She said, now that sounds like my kind of book. It is by Charlotte Young, and the book is called The Heir of Redcliffe. The Heir of Redcliffe from 1853. It's a Victorian romance novel about family strife, and it was written by this woman, Charlotte Young. Sorry, not DeYoung, if only. who wrote it under the supervision of her pastor, who was a man named John Keble, K-E-B-L-E. You probably haven't heard of him, but he was very influential in something called the Oxford movement in the middle part of the 19th century. The Oxford movement were Anglicans who were they were advocating for almost an Anglo-Catholicism, high church Anglicanism, liturgy, and it's one of the reasons probably that Kuyper had an affinity for high church and high liturgy in the Dutch Reformed Church. So she writes this book, and it was very intentionally, kind of like today, here's a Christian movie to teach Christian things. This book was written to try to teach something. It had a didactic purpose. And Kuyper reads the book and is deeply moved by it. It was designed to lead people to see the value of sincere Christian virtue. Many literary types, as you can imagine, did not like the book. Thought it was pretty cheap, pretty formulaic. Oscar Wilde, if you know that name, he's always good for a quip. He once met a condemned criminal in jail who was reading this book, and he commented, "My heart was turned by the eyes of the doomed man, but if he reads The Heir of Redcliffe, it's perhaps just as well to let the law take its course." Well, if you're going to read that book, then you might as well just meet your maker. With ordinary people, however, it was a smashing success. Some people have considered it the most popular novel of the age, even surpassing Charles Dickens, who we all know about. The novel is about a man named Guy Morville, who is heir to the Redcliffe estate, and his cousin Philip Morville, who is haughty, conceited, a hypocrite. And Kuyper saw himself in this man Philip. He said the book, quote, was the instrument that broke my smug, rebellious heart. He said, I see myself in that man. I haven't read the book, just read about the book. I think he has a redemptive turn to it. So he becomes then a confessional Calvinist, and he directs his prodigious gifts toward preaching in a way that people can understand. Marks his conversion to Orthodox, we might say evangelical, confessional Calvinism. At age 30, he moved to Utrecht, another city, and he writes for a paper called The Herald. Later, he starts a paper called The Standard. In his lifetime, it's estimated, he authored over 20,000 newspaper articles, and plus pamphlets and learned works of theology, politics, and history. Utrecht at the time was the center of what we might call a kind of God and country conservatism. And you might think, if you know a little bit about Kuyper, or sense where this is going, that might be a sweet spot for Kuyper. He's a confessional Calvinist. He wants to see Calvinism invade all of Dutch life, and yet he's not really enamored with this kind of God and country conservatism. And when you hear these terms, don't equate that these are all the same things as the way the terms are used in 2025 in America. He championed a religiously pluralistic approach to education. This is one of the things that Kuyper is just very hard to put into a box that fits all of our neat categories. There are things that, quote, that 2025 conservatives would like and things that 2025 liberals might like. The schools, the public schools, the state schools, he thought were becoming overrun with liberalism. He said the schools were becoming, quote, a sect school of modernism. And worse, he thought they would lead to atheism. So he argued that the only fair policy, and this became one of the main ideas throughout his life, he argued that the only fair policy was for the state to fund a variety of options. So this is where Kuyper doesn't neatly fit into category. You might think that he just said, well, these state schools, they're turning modern. They ought to be like the schools used to be, and they ought to be our good Calvinist schools. He says, no, what we ought to have is a plurality of options, all of which the state provides for. So you can go to this modernist school if you want. You can go to a Reform school, a Catholic school, a Jewish school. That was his idea. And eventually, by the end of his life, that will win the day and became one of the major issues. In fact, why for really, it's changed a little bit in the last generation, but for a couple generations, and you still see this influence throughout America and Canada, where you find Christian schools, they were so often started by Dutch Reformed, or in some way had their roots in Dutch Reformed people, maybe who had become Presbyterian, because Kuyper was absolutely adamant that you must have thoroughly Christian schools. Now, he didn't think that you couldn't have other schools. The state could provide all manner of schools, but he wanted options. In 1870, he took the call to be the pastor of a prestigious church in Amsterdam. He became the editor of The Standard. That's one of the newspapers, which was a daily. I think I read the first daily newspaper in the Netherlands, while still writing for the weekly paper. So he had a daily newspaper, a weekly newspaper. Now, here in 2025, we think papers, and not very many people subscribe to papers anymore. But this was the technology of the day. This is how you had mass dissemination of your ideas. He harnessed the new technology. Like, he started an award-winning podcast. He was the Joe Rogan of Dutch Calvinism. And he had a dynamic blog, or he was always on Twitter. I think the digital world has its own dangers, but he was harnessing the technology of his day. He flirted with the higher life holiness movement for a time that came out of Britain, but he ended up rejecting that and settling back in to a confessional Calvinism. In 1876, he has his second major nervous breakdown. And what happens with Kuyper, each breakdown gets a little worse, and then when he comes back, it's like has even bigger ambitions and bigger dreams and more energy, and will just drive to another collapse. He began turning his attention in the 1870s explicitly to politics. He was drawn to the views of a man who would be well known in the Netherlands and not to us, Groen van Prinsterer. We'll just call him Groen, not Gru from the Minions, Groen. He was born into a wealthy aristocratic family, and in many ways you could think of Groen as the grandfather of the Neo-Calvinist movement. He was an intellectual father to Kuyper. Groen was a historian, a politician. He called his political views, this won't make intuitive sense to us, but he called them Christian historical. He was the leader of a movement which Kuyper will turn into a political party, and this name will take some explaining, the Anti-Revolutionary Party, abbreviated the ARP, different than our beloved ARP Church's Associate Reform. What does he mean, anti-revolutionary? Well, 1870s, what revolution might you still be thinking of? You'd still be thinking of the French Revolution. Revolution here means the French Revolution, and not just that, but the spirit of the French Revolution, which Groen and then Kuyper took to be pervasive throughout Europe. He said this spirit of the French Revolution means the exaltation of reason, dead Enlightenment naturalism. It means the rejection of God, a materialism, a secular humanism, an all-encompassing worldview of unbelief. That's what anti-revolutionary means. Kuyper wrote to this man in 1864. They met in 1869. He dies, Groen, in 1876. Some people have said that Groen van Prinsterer was like a general without an army. He had these great ideas, and he didn't yet have an army. And it took Abraham Kuyper, who had the organizational skills and the public charisma to build the army and lead the army. Kuyper wanted to make Orthodox Calvinists a political force in the Netherlands. So he starts the first daily newspaper. In 1874, he is elected to Parliament. So he leaves the pastorate in 1874, and he is elected to the Parliament. And he still retains a role on the consistory, kind of like the session for the city in Amsterdam. And his main education, or main issue, was education. He wanted state aid for religious schools. He organized a massive petition campaign. Eventually, he formed what has been called the Monstrous Coalition because it included Catholics. It included Protestants and Catholics because the Catholics said, you know what? We want state aid for our schools too. And then in 1878, out of this petition drive and all of this populist public support, in 1878, he founds the ARP, the Anti-Revolutionary Party. He rejected views of popular sovereignty as they existed in France or state sovereignty as they existed in Germany. He believed God was the sovereign. God was the lawgiver. He wanted to see, quote, God's holy ordinances established in the home, in the school, in the state for the good of the people. That's what he wanted. By 1880, Kuyper had brought together three national movements. So one of these national movements, just had up here, is the ARP, that party. Two was the Christian school movement and association. And then three was this movement which he called the Free University Society. University. Sometimes abbreviated VU because that's in Dutch. Vrij is free, the Free University. These three strands come together. And in 1880, in fact, now, school, maybe some of you have heard of, the Free University of Amsterdam. So it's amazing. He's been a pastor, theologian, preacher, parliament. I got extra time. I start a university, the Free University of Amsterdam. Now, what does he mean by free? This is very important. Free from state control and free from church control. You want both of those. And he taught theology there. And his idea with the Free University was that every discipline, medicine, law, science, history, literature, would all be shaped by a reformed way of looking at the world. His inaugural address was entitled Sovereignty in the Distinct Spheres of Human Life. Anyone, if you've ever studied Kuyper or maybe just been influenced by Christian education movements, will have heard of that idea, sphere sovereignty. It's the contention that society has multiple spheres of activity, little bubbles of activity, and that each one operates according to its own set of rules and ideas. So there's a coherent set of rules that operate in these various spheres. And connecting all of the spheres, of course, is God himself. And it's in this address Kuyper utters his most famous sentence, and one of the most famous sentences a Christian has probably uttered in the last 150 years. Quote, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine, mine.'" So these spheres, which operate according to the rules, ought to, each one of them, be shaped and infiltrated by the lordship of Jesus Christ. Now, fast forwarding through much of his political career, which gets difficult and tedious to understand, especially if we're not well versed, as I'm not, in Dutch politics of the 19th and early 20th century. So the suffrage, that is the vote, is extended to various groups, and each time that more people are able to vote in Dutch society, it shapes and shifts the different parties and the coalitions. Remember that in a parliamentary system, so we're used to in America for a long, long time, you have two parties. It's a two-party system. Parliamentary system, you have many political parties, and you don't have an election for a president on the ballot, but you have a party that will have control, and then they will appoint their prime minister. Now, it's often determined, this person will be the prime minister if we win, and then many times you have to have a coalition government. So if you don't have an absolute majority of seats in the parliament, you have to form a coalition with others, and you have a coalition government. So he continues to operate, and after consolidating power in the ARP, he has a third nervous breakdown, once again travels abroad to recuperate, but by 1900 he is really at the peak of his powers. He's received honorary degrees, and in 1898 he does these stone lectures I'll say more about. And he's teaching theology at a very high level at the Free University, and is a well-respected academic around the world. And in 1900, they win a coalition victory, and Kuyper is made prime minister in 1901. He faces a railroad strike. He's eventually ousted in 1905, so he serves as prime minister for 4 years, following which he takes a 9-month trip around the Mediterranean, good way to recuperate. And he writes what do you do if you're kind of, I just served prime minister. I go around the Mediterranean and I write a book about what I see, and it becomes a very popular, insightful book. Eventually, full equality is granted to religious schools, each of them funded by the state. Suffrage is given to all by 1917. His coalition breaks up in 1925. Fast forwarding 2 generations later, this ARP eventually merged in 1980 with the Catholic People's Party and the Christian Historical Union Party, which had broke away from the ARP, and they formed the Christian Democratic Appeal Party. I believe that is still an operating party in the Netherlands parliamentary system. Let's say a little bit about Kuyper in the church before we come to his big ideas. Bavinck and Kuyper were both engaged in so many things, and they excelled in so many areas, it is easy to forget that they were first of all churchmen. And here's where we're going to come back and try to understand these various splits and mergers and splinters in the Dutch church. So that is the state church. In 1834, there's something called the afscheiding, which is Dutch for secession. Have one C, or you get it. You can't even read it. Maybe once for secession in 1834. So this is a secession. The afscheiding breaks away from the state church. Now, if you are a Michigander like I am, this is important because many of the leaders in this afscheiding movement will immigrate to the United States. So, for example, Henrik Scholte would leave for America and found the town of Pella, Iowa. Albertus van Raalte was a leader in the afscheiding. He left the Netherlands in 1846, founded the town of Holland, Michigan. My alma mater, Hope College. There are lots of Van Raalte things around Hope College, and really a remarkable man. In 1857, here in the United States, many of the people who came from this secession group then left the Reformed Church in America for the Christian Reformed Church, but Van Raalte stayed with the original group. It wasn't called the Christian Reformed Church at that time. They very humbly called it the True Protestant Dutch Reformed Church. Say that, you just mentioned. So I grew up in the RCA, Tom Grolsema from the CRC. Some of you may have a CRC background. And the Dutch immigration waves that came to the United States after that, more history about your pastor than you care to know, but so I was from the RCA, and then the breakaway, the CRC, and because new waves in the 19th and 20th century of Dutch immigrants, they almost all came to the Christian Reformed Church because they considered that to be more pure and more orthodox, and it probably was. It was certainly more Dutch. And they came with Kuyper's ideas. So the CRC, Calvin College, all very influenced by Kuyper. You might say, well, Kevin, you grew up in this tradition. Well, I heard almost nothing about Kuyper growing up. I went to public school. It was just the way things were. Everyone in the RCA kids went to public schools. CRC kids went to Christian schools. It was just that's what the CRC people do, and it was just what the RCA people do. Now, thankfully, you go to public school in the 80s in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I learned about John Calvin and predestination and all sorts of things in the 80s and 90s. But the split here will affect these American denominations as the descendants of Kuyper come and they join the CRC. So back to the Netherlands. There's this group called the Afscheiding. Oh, and Orange City, Iowa, where I first pastored, that was founded by settlers from Pella who, like good Dutchmen, were looking for cheaper land. And so they left Pella and they went up to, and they found some of the best farmland in the country up there. Kuyper has a group that leaves the state church in 1886 called the Dolianti, which is Dutch for the grieving. They were grieving, they were sort of pushed out, they were grieving the liberalism and the modernism in the state church. And Kuyper takes about 10% of the church out with him in the Dolianti. They come together, now these two groups come together and they form in 1892, or 1890, a new denomination called the Gereformeerde Kerken in Nederland. I won't write it all up there, but this is the NHK, this is the GKN. The Gereformeerde, that's with a G, Kerken in Nederland, the GKN. So both of these were reform movements within the state church that failed, and they come to form this new denomination, and it's not always an easy coalition for these two different groups to come together. Now, here's a significant event in this denomination. In 1896, 8 ministers in the GKN issue, the official term is a gravamen. A gravamen is when you issue an official protest against some point of received doctrine. So 8 ministers issue a gravamen against, I have it here, their doctrinal standards. So I grew up, 3 forms of unity, Heidelberg Catechism, Belgic Confession, Canons of Dort. So the Belgic Confession, which is from 1561, these are just like we have the Westminster, they have these doctrinal standards. And Article 36 in the Belgic Confession is on the civil magistrate. And 8 ministers issue a gravamen, including Kuyper and Bavinck, so you got some firepower. And they object to a line in the Belgic Confession. The Synod does what good Reformed people do. When there's a controversy, they appoint a committee to study the issue, and not very happy to those who didn't like the gravamen, they appoint Kuyper and Bavinck to be on the committee. It comes back finally in 1905, and the Synod deletes these words. This is the Christian Reformed Church version, and you can, Article 36, the civil government, and it has here in a footnote, Well, eventually the Christian Reformed Church deleted as well, and they put a new addition. The Presbyterians, this has to do with the civil magistrate. The Presbyterians, in forming the National Presbyterian Church here in 1788, revised chapter 23 of the Westminster Confession because they had a new view of church and state. So this is an inconvenient truth for some people who want to look to Kuyper and Neo-Calvinism and say, well, these are the guys. This is what it looks like to really have Christianity rule in a country. Well, there's a lot of tensions in Kuyper's viewpoint. Here's the line that they delete from the Belgic Confession. The government's task of restraining evil and sustaining good is not limited to the public order, but also includes the protection of the church and its ministry in order that all idolatry and false worship may be removed and prevented. The kingdom of Antichrist may be destroyed, the kingdom of Christ may come, the word of the gospel may be preached everywhere, and God may be honored and served by everyone as he requires in his word. That is still controversial. You can find people online debating this. Well, this is when everything went wrong. They should have never taken that out of the Belgic Confession. But Kuyper and Bavinck, and then eventually the Synod for their denomination, the GKN, say, we don't believe, one, that this is tenable, and two, we don't believe that this is biblically mandated. That is, in particular, this line, that the civil magistrate should remove all idolatry and false worship in the kingdom of the Antichrist. And we'll come to Kuyper's views here in just a moment. He thought that the Reformed forefathers had not gone all the way with their logic on liberty of conscience. The Synod also settled a number of differences between Bavinck and Kuyper. They did not see everything the same theologically. And Bavinck was the more careful of the two, and the Synod in 1905 sides with Bavinck. They appreciate Kuyper. Bavinck wasn't but on a number of issues, Bavinck is saying, well, my friend Abraham Kuyper, let's moderate a little bit what he said. Kuyper had an aggressive supralapsarianism. There, just to put that on your bingo card for today. If you don't know what that is, it has to do with God's decrees, and that's all that we need to say about it right now. Kuyper also has a novel view of justification from eternity, that we are justified in eternity. We would say we're justified when we profess faith in Christ. We're justified from eternity. He had a view that people can be regenerated apart from the means of grace. He had a view of presumptive regeneration, that covenant children presumably are already regenerated. On each of these issues, Bavinck said, we got to be a little more careful here. And the Synod sided with Bavinck. In 1898, Kuyper gives these stone lectures on Calvinism at Princeton Theological Seminary. He espouses a number of ideas that you may not have even known come downstream from Kuyper. No neutrality. Regeneration distinguishes the way Christians think and non-Christians think. Sowing the seeds for what later would be called a presuppositional way of doing theology, apologetics, arguing for Christian truth in the public square. Now we come to the end of his life. He dies in 1920. So you can see he just makes it through World War I. Not surprisingly, this is a cataclysmic event in Europe and in Kuyper's own life. And he doesn't live long enough to really figure out how do the pieces of his intellectual framework fit together after World War I. Do they fit together? The Netherlands was steadfastly neutral during the war, though within the Netherlands, public sentiment was divided, and this may be a bit of a surprise. Kuyper came down on the pro-German side during World War I. What was so disorienting to Kuyper, many like him, he considered World War I a fratricide and a suicide. Fratricide means a war between brothers. He said, these are Christian lands. These are Christian peoples. So he still inherits, though he moves away from a lot of the Christendom ideas, he still has a Christendom kind of mindset that Europe, these are Christian lands. We are a Christian people. And how could it be that these Christian lands are slaughtering each other by the millions? He feared it was not just a fratricide, but a suicide. His last speech was fittingly called, "Wat nu?" What now? And he reasserted many of his familiar ideas, but he wondered aloud what might have to change with these new realities. He wasn't sure social and political questions could be kept separate. He wasn't sure that the individual could be the source of the center of social well-being. He wasn't sure that his vision of limited government could be sustained in the face of new challenges. And perhaps it's fitting, the last thing he wrote was on the end times and the coming of Christ. Abraham Kuyper died on November 8, 1920. Let's try to summarize and evaluate just some of his main ideas. Let me quickly list 7 big ideas. He was a big man who had big ideas. And even if you've never heard of Kuyper or neo-Calvinism, you'll hear how we've been influenced by these. So 1, orthodox and modern. How do we hold that together? Can it be held together? Is that even the right question? Kuyper said, first, seek to have for yourself the life your fathers had, and then hold fast what you have, then articulate that life in your own language as they did in theirs. So he said, we cannot repristinate the past. Don't try to recreate the world they had. Look for the faith that they had, the vitality that they had. And then he said, try to articulate it in your own language for your own day. 2, worldview. We've all heard that language. Every Christian school on the planet has had a mission statement at some point that says integrate faith and learning. He pioneers this idea of a holistic, God-centered orientation toward all things, an all-embracing way of life, a coherent view of everything, that Christians were to deploy this world and life view into every vocation, every corner of daily life, social activity. This is the mother idea of neo-Calvinism, how man's life is to be lived in the presence of God, under his sovereignty, to his glory. 3rd, and this is where I have my most significant disagreement with Kuyper, he and Bavinck argued for an expansive view of the mission of the church. So the church was to seek the welfare of humanity by the caring for souls and bodies. It was to be a ministry of word and deed, evangelism and mercy ministry. The church's mission was to engage in every sphere of life, not just the Christian, which I would agree with, but also the institutional church. 4, his view of common grace. In the United States, there's a small Reformed denomination called Protestant Reformed, and they broke away from the Christian Reformed in the 1920s because they rejected this doctrine of common grace. Kuyper and most have said, well, we can see it in Calvin. Others have said, no, this is a novel idea. Here's the issue that people like Kuyper have to face. We Calvinists have such a dim view of human nature, the lostness of man in sin, the radical rebellion in the human heart. So how do we make apparent sense that there seem to be a lot of good people out there? At least basic decency. And if all of that is true with the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of light and this sharp antithesis, how do we participate meaningfully in this fallen world? And the doctrine of common grace was to answer both of those questions. That's what gives us the opportunity to do so. 5, he has an idea, maybe you haven't heard this term before, called pillarization, like a pillar. His view was that no one group should control society. This is where, again, it's very hard to put Kuyper in a box because you get expansive view of the mission of the church, you get world and life view, and you might think Kuyper is saying that Christians ought to run everything and the whole place should be Christian, but right or wrong, that's not what he was saying. Pillarization means you have the state, you have trade unions, you have social institutions, and you have various religious groups. They each have sphere sovereignty, and each ideological group is like a pillar to hold up this Dutch society. Now, some of that you have to realize is the history of the Netherlands itself, which has always had some moderating, tolerating streams in it because it broke away from Catholics, and though it came to be a very reformed place, it was never an overwhelming majority, even though that became the state church. So he said, we have these pillars, and he was not arguing for Calvinism to be the culture, but to be a subculture. Again, you can agree or disagree. But he was arguing for pillars, which leads to a sixth idea, which, again, people today like and some don't, called principled pluralism. So you say, well, he has this idea, no neutrality. There's a godless system, and then there's the Christian Calvinist system. And he says there's no non-religious common ground. He is against a naked public square. He's against Christians saying, well, I guess we can't bring Christian ideas into the public square. At the same time, he's very adamant that government's role is not to decide what constitutes true religion. Now, he says secularism is a religion too. That's one of his big insights. Secularism is a religion too. So they think they're being neutral, but they're not. He wants government to enshrine none of them. Government, he says, has no right to trespass into the other spheres. So he had a view of limited government. Government cannot trespass into the family, into religion, into the marketplace. It is to ensure that good order is kept, rights are protected, and all are treated fairly. So a principled pluralism, meaning you bring the full weight of your Christian convictions, your Calvinism into the public square, but you understand that you're not trying to be the only pillar, you are one pillar. It's a principled pluralism. And finally, then, his seventh idea, as I list them to you, he advocated the sovereignty of the church and the sovereignty of the state. He argued for the separation of church and state, but not the separation of Christianity and culture. The two are not identical. In his stone lectures, this is very interesting. Now, it's a generalization. You'd have to go think, well, is that true or not? He argued, Calvinism has been most influential in three nations, he could say in 1898. What three nations? Give them to me. The Netherlands, America, Great Britain. That's where Calvinism has been most influential. And he says it's no accident that political freedom and liberty of conscience are most respected and revered in these three lands. Now, don't break your arm patting yourself on the back. He also said, interestingly, in these lands, three great revolutions in the Calvinist world, which left untouched the glory of God and even proceeded from the acknowledgement of God and his majesty. So he's the anti-revolutionary guy, but he says there's three revolutions in each of these lands, and they actually left the glory of God intact. What are those three revolutions? The Dutch revolt against Spain under William the Silent, the Glorious Revolution, which led to William and Mary, William is a Dutchman, to sit on the throne in England, and then, of course, our own American Revolution in 1776. He argued that the role of the magistrate was to maintain justice. He said the duty of the magistrate was in three things, and this is where he does not fit into a neat box. He said the magistrate's duty toward God, he should recognize God as the supreme ruler. He should rule the people according to God's ordinances. He should restrain blasphemy. God should be confessed in the Constitution. He should maintain the Sabbath. He should call for days of prayer and thanksgiving, and he should ask for God's blessing upon the nation. Well, that's going to sound like, for lack of a better term, a Christian nationalism. But he also says, toward the church, the government should suspend its own judgment, not because it has a false idea of neutrality, but, he said, the government lacks the data of judgment and must not interfere with the sovereignty of the church. So, this is the tension. He assumes, and we'll come to this at the very end, he for all of his novel ingenuity, understandably, he can't really fathom a land that isn't one sort of religion. Maybe multiple denominations, there's some Jews there, Catholics, but really kind of one thing. But he says the government, the magistrate, must respect the multiform manifestation of the church on earth. Now, what that would mean if you have Muslims and Hindus and other religions, he's thinking mainly of manifestations of Christianity. But he wanted disestablishment. He did not want a state church. He thought disestablishment was right biblically and it was best for the church. And then he said the magistrate's relationship toward the individual. He said the rights of conscience are primordial and inalienable. And here he even admits that he's going beyond what his Reformed forefathers had done. Quote, "I am forced to admit that our fathers, in theory, had not the courage of the conclusion which follows from this liberty of conscience. For the liberty of speech and the liberty of worship must also be protected." He said they talked about liberty of conscience and they couldn't quite go all the way there, and they still wanted the civil magistrate to suppress heresies, to reform the church. He says they made a mistake. Liberty of speech, liberty of worship must also be protected. So how then in these last 5 minutes should we assess the legacy of Abraham Kuyper? It's been influential as especially Dutch and Reformed ideas have gone around the world. He has an influence in Korea and Indonesia, certainly in Canada, the United States. The epicenter has been Grand Rapids through people like Voss and Van Til, her own Presbyterian tradition. Kuyper was undoubtedly a force of nature. Here's a paragraph from the biography. As a partial list, Abraham Kuyper was a minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, the driving force behind a major schism in that church, a professor of theology, the longtime editor of a daily newspaper, the founder of the Netherlands' first mass-based political party, an effective advocate for public funding of religious schools, the founder of a university, a celebrated traveler in Britain and America, a member of the Dutch Parliament, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and throughout his adult life, an absolutely indefatigable author on topics political, theological, cultural, and devotional, and somehow he also managed to fit time for several long collapses from nervous exhaustion that seemed only to bring him back with larger ambitions for longer agendas. Bratt says in the biography, Kuyper could be pious, sensitive, devotional, also arrogant, scheming, dominating over others. You simply don't do all of these things without having an overwhelming, dominating personality. Bratt says he was an extremely rare combination. This is extremely rare. First-rate intellect and first-rate organizer. You don't usually get both. Bratt says Abraham Kuyper was a great man, but not a nice one. Talented, energetic, supremely confident, ambitious, driven, and, this is an insight which we've probably all seen in different people, more generous to his opponents on the other side than he was to those who were closest to him and differed on small matters. He'd be magnanimous and generous if you were miles away from him intellectually, but near to him, he could be very bitter, angry. He drew in disciples and liked to collaborate, but he pushed people away if they dared to relate to him as an equal. He was an idea man, the bigger the better, and then he sometimes lacked patience to see through the details or deal with inconsistencies. And Bratt says, in public, he often showed a better understanding of God than of himself. It was said that, the biographer says, when he set out to write the biography, someone gave him this good advice. First, you will love the man, then you will detest him, and then you are ready to understand him. What about these major ideas? I just want to leave you that there's much to learn, and we are left with lingering questions and enduring tensions in his own thought. So this Kuyperian transformationalism, which is very popular. You might say, well, others have responded with the doctrine of the two kingdoms. Isn't that an old Reformed idea? And doesn't that chasten some of Kuyper's transformationalism? Is Kuyperianism bound to be triumphalistic or somewhat naive or overweening in its attempt to change the world? What about the spirituality of the church, which was formed in Scotland and especially here among Southern Presbyterians? That is to say, Kuyperianism has not been the only reformed way to understand the relationship between church and society. And if the goal of the church is to transform society, does this move us in a leftward direction, for lack of a better word, or in a rightward direction? I would say, somewhat provocatively, that in our day, these years, perhaps two of the most effective proponents of Kuyperian transformationalism have been Tim Keller and Doug Wilson, and you don't have to know much about them to know that they applied it in very different ways. So does Kuyperianism mean we ought to be engaging with the arts, social justice, the poor, work for human flourishing? There's more Keller emphases. Or does it mean the church should be outspoken in political commentary and enshrine Christian laws and work for a Christian nation? I admit that in my own context in the RCA and related to CRC in Grand Rapids, almost every time I came across someone who was bringing Kuyperianism into the public square, it almost always meant left-leaning political ideas. So I admit I have some allergic reaction to it. And what about the concept of worldview, which all of us have said and probably like? There have been a number of reactions in the last 10 or 20 years to this very idea, saying, well, is the whole concept of worldview a little too rationalistic? Is it naive about how people are actually formed, that we just have certain doctrines in our head? What about the way our hearts are formed, or our cultural liturgies? Does worldview end up like a bumper sticker that casually gets applied only to elite sort of professions? You know, it's one thing to say, what's your worldview as an artist? But how does a Christian worldview in Kuyperianism relate to the proverbial plumber? Without Kuyper's conversion, here's a danger. Without his conversion experience, without his deep and learned commitment to all the hard edges of Calvinism, Kuyperianism can become dominated by ethical, political, social concerns, such that the transcendent God of Calvinism actually gets talked about very little. One of his central insights was to show that this modern world was not neutral. It, too, has a way of seeing things, that there's no just, well, you're religious, we're neutral, why don't you just come and look neutral with me? That was one of Neo-Calvinism's great insights. At the same time, he wanted various religious groups to not dominate any of the others. So we're left with different impulses in Kuyperianism. Should we emphasize the antithesis, which someone like Cornelius Van Til from Westminster tradition would do? Or emphasize his teaching on common grace, which someone like Richard Mao from Fuller Seminary would do? What's the real Kuyperian influence? And is it good and evil, black and white, no neutrality, antithesis? Or is the major insight common grace allows us to all work together? Is the big idea no neutrality? All right, so it's Christian or it's pagan. Or is it pillarization? Well, you can have each one of your pillars to exist in society. You can see, though Kuyper was not an apartheid, he didn't invent apartheid, and I don't think it was a fair distillation of his views, but you can see pillarization. It's easy for South Africans, Dutch South Africans, to take this idea and say, you know what, that's right. We have our pillar, and we got our white Dutch Reform pillar. You're going to have a black pillar, and once you have just pillars, it can very easily meaning complete separation, subjugation, segregation. It's not what he had in mind, but you can see where the idea comes from. These difficulties were not fully felt, I would contend, because he still inhabited a shared Christian consensus in what was a small, basically monocultural country. You know how big the Netherlands is? It's about the size of Maryland and Delaware. You know how many people were in the Netherlands in 1900? About 5 million people. And they were ethnically, racially, religiously very homogenous by today's standards. So we're left with these questions. How do we, in this country, which spans a continent of 330 million people, diverse ethnically, linguistically, religiously, what can we learn? Well, we see the importance of education. We see the importance of a confident Calvinism in the public square. We see the importance of building institutions and networks. We see the importance of being engaged with the broader world. We see the importance of thinking through the issues in our day rather than simply thinking that we can go back to 1900 Netherlands or 16th century Geneva or 1788 Philadelphia. I'll end you with this line from Kuyper, which directs us to the sovereignty of God. He concludes his lectures on Calvinism by asking, in essence, am I really naive enough to expect a reversal of religious fortune? See, already he was seeing religion, and Orthodox religion was in decline. And he says, the quickening of life comes not from men. It is the prerogative of God. And it is due to his sovereign will alone whether or not the tide of religious life rise high in one century and low ebb in the next. Unless God sends forth his Spirit, he says, there will be no turning, and we will descend. And he uses the imagery of a harp, waiting for the wind to blow music upon that harp. And he says this, we are absolutely powerless to accomplish anything lasting apart from the quickening Spirit of God. Still, we feel it our God-given duty to keep our harp, its strings tuned aright, ready in the window of God's holy Zion, awaiting the breath of the Spirit.